everybody was living in poverty. Let us remember that born in 1943, the first 10, 12 years of my life, we still had rationing. You survived as best you could. You took your dad's suit to the pawn shop on a Monday morning to get a few bob to help you to get through the week. If you could do a little bit of work somewhere, get a bit of money, I'm talking about the children now, the kids, you did do. Personally, I worked on the market at Moss Side, 6 o'clock in the morning, loading fish onto the fish stall, winter, freezing cold.
Before I was 19 years of age, I think I had about 24 jobs. I think it was about 10, 11 years of age, I did what is commonly known as a bookies runner. Them days it was illegal to bet really, and they used to have bookies in the back entries, and we used to go into the pubs. There was the Lincoln, the Marlborough, the Ivy Bowers, the Radnor. We used to go in there and used to write the bets on the back of a packet of cigarettes and put a name on the bottom like Happy X, which my dad's name was, and they give you a penny or twopence to go and put the bets on. But remember, you're getting a penny or twopence off each person, and it did mount up. Then we used to run down the entry and went into this backyard. And when you went in the backyard, you used to have the windows, and it opened, and you gave him the bets. You then went back at the evening, and you picked any bets up with money on and took them back to the pubs.
We've got to remember it was a very busy area. There was all sorts of industries, main ones being breweries. There must have been 3 or 4, if not more, breweries, and a lot of people, a lot of men people work there. Shops, lots of shops. The road we're on now, Stratford Road, massive main shopping area in the middle of Hulme. So lots of people would have worked in shops.
I was born just across the road from the Junction pub, and apparently my mum and dad was getting married. You just couldn't get your own place. You had to lodge with people or find digs somewhere. And they had the brewery that owned the Junction had a broken down house. It had no roof, and I think they said it had 3.5 walls. And they contacted the brewery and they said to them, if we can do that house up, can we rent? And they said, you can. If you can do that house up, you can rent it. And she said every week when they got paid, they went and bought a toilet or they buy a bath and they built the walls and they put the roof on, or the roof that was missing. And when the man come from the brewery to check that it was safe to go in there, he said, you've done such a good job on it. He went, you can have it rent free.
Early life, they lived on Monton Street. Yeah, when my brother was little, I remember her telling me about sitting up all night, picking the bedbugs off, killing them, in a one-room place. I came along, my dad was still on the ships. He was so excited to, he was going to have a child, that he went to register at Bradford Gasworks. And the man said, prove to me you're legal in this country. And he said he ran all the way back to Moss Side and got his prison of war record and his ship record and went back and registered. He did one more trip, and whilst he was away, my mum found out the house was able to be rented on Radnor Street and knew that no one would let to my dad. So she signed the rent book herself, which was really problematic in the family. It's taking the power away from the man, isn't it? Because that meant the house was in his name. But it wasn't a house, it was a shop. It was a shop that we lived in. I can remember almost everybody that lived on our block on Radnor Street, very much so. And I remember there used to be a row quite regular on a Saturday night between Billy the cobbler and I can't remember, I think they were called Molly and Jimmy, I think. They were the window cleaners. And Billy would come out drunk and curse the English, and he'd come out and curse the Irish, and things like that. But I went to Webster Street School, and Webster Street School was called the League of Nations. So that tells you what the place was like. Hulme was white, but it was also mixed.
Certainly everybody knew everybody's business. And I think they genuinely cared for each other, because there were people that had nothing. They all had nothing, so when one had nothing, somebody else would help out. So if you've got no sugar, I'll give you some sugar, but could do with an egg if you've got a spare. And that's how it worked.
Most of Manchester, anyhow, will have to be rebuilt in the next 50 years.
Rebuilt? Why is that?
Because Manchester's falling down, decomposing in front of our very eyes. About 60% of our houses are built more than 24 to an acre. Most of these 120,000 houses are so old that the medical officer of health reckons more than half of them are quite unfit for folk to live in. So they've got to be rebuilt in any case. It's not money I'm thinking of.
Well, what then?
Will people themselves pay the price? Do they realize that they will have to move elsewhere?
Did it need demolishing? Yes. The house is in a terrible state. Didn't matter how much work you did on it, it would have still been a slum. They did need pulling down.
Some of the houses were really crappy, let's be fair. But it is true that people who own their houses, and I never thought about it, we were getting like 50 quid at the time. My dad had 3 houses and ended up in a masonette in Ancoats because they didn't pay them jack, you know what I mean?
You was sent a letter, maybe a week approximately beforehand, with the address on. In our case, it was Benchill, Wythenshawe, Green Hill Road. And on a certain date, you arranged for your removal, and you moved. There was no choice. You went to that address, and that was it. A sad memory is the scrap metal men slowly cruising around the area, watching people actually moving the furniture out of the houses. And the minute you'd walked out, you didn't even get time to shut the door, it wasn't worth bothering. They'd be in there stripping the lead piping out, copper piping, anything of any value, like vultures waiting to feed off the body of something, you know. You're feeling apprehensive, your mother's feeling even worse, nobody knows exactly what's going to happen in the future, and there's these people like feeding off your remains. A bad, unhappy, sad time.
That disruption and that demolition, so many people have got a lot to answer for, because it was people's lives that they were destroying. I mean, to say that we lived in slums was an insult, an absolute insult, because the people of Hulme were proud people and they were proud of who they were and where they lived.
We were really close-knit family, and these two were old maiden aunts, Auntie Mary and Auntie Kate. I remember them being very, very upset because they'd lived in that house forever. It was 112 Ward Street. And, you know, they'd buried their mum from there, they buried their dad and their brother from there. And there was lots of births. You know, we were like the 3rd generation that had been nurtured in that house. So it was a massive, massive rift for them, and them being really, really upset.
So when we actually moved to Benchill, even though the house was reasonable to live in and clean and acceptable, the minute you came out of the house, you were surrounded with total strangers. Not the sort of people you could make friends with, because they just stared at you, because in our case, we were so different. We wasn't just strangers, but we was a different colour. Whether that had anything to do with it, I'm not sure. But there was people who we could not make friends with at all. So we felt isolated. On a worse note, the older people who couldn't get out and about, you'd hear people talking about them. And time again, somebody would say to you, have you heard about Mr. So-and-so? And you knew what they was going to say. They'd say, oh, he's died. Have you heard about Mrs. Johnson or whatever? Oh, yeah, she's passed away. And this was happening in a period of months. This is the sort of thing you hear now and again. But this was confined to months, so it must have been connected with moving into this, what I call alien environment, you know.
18 years ago, right in the clearance area of Greenhays, they were asking us questions about, have you got marriage lines, things like that, you know, and people had lived together for years, you know what I mean? And the dreadful things like that happened, you know, and if you was in multi-occupied houses, there was going to be 500 left on the streets. We grouped together and we fought and we got the victories in that area, you know, and changed policies. Those policies were that nobody was to be put in the street, even though they ended up in this bloody lot.
The stereotype urban myth is that Manchester Council decided to build slum housing out of concrete because it was cheap and gave them a bit of a fashionable kick. But actually, the corporation didn't want to do it at all. And I don't think a lot of people know that. What happened was that the government sent all councils various letters throughout the year, directives from the Ministry of Housing and local government, saying, we want you to build certain types of housing, and we'll give you loans for those, but not for anything else. We don't just want you to do it, we insist you do it. If you don't do it, you can build houses anywhere you like, but you won't get any money from us for it. Of course, they knew that was the only way a council could build housing, by government loans. So Manchester Corporation had to do it, and they had to tear up their plans for brick-built homes. They built Hulme 1, which was St George's in Shaw Green, but Hulme 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 had to be scrapped. So they said, right, if we've got to do it, let's do it. Let's call in all the builders, we'll have an open day, they can show us all their plans, and we'll pick what we think is the best system-built housing, and they did.
Well, my mum decided that she wanted to come back to Hulme, and we were really excited because we thought it was going to be like before with me great-gran and great-granddads and aunties and uncles. So we wanted to. So the day around, she said, right, I've got a set of keys and we're going to see a property. And I can't remember if we came on the bus or if it was a taxi. All I can remember was being stood at the foot of the big bridge, surrounded by these really futuristic buildings. It was round, it was curved, it was cubes. And my mum, I can remember my mum going into a panic and saying, I don't know where I'm going. She had to try and find her bearings to find where Ward Street and Dunham Street was by the post office. Wilkinson's post office was still just off the foot of the bridge. And that was how she got her bearings to find our way to the red bricks.
And moving here to Hulme was really good, to walk into your house and all airy, open air spaces, and we had a downstairs toilet, an upstairs bathroom with a toilet in it. These were all, it was new to us and we loved it and we took pride in our homes. To rear children was easy in that early time. Children played out. You could let them out. The only worries you had was the ice cream man came around too many times. So you were permanently threatening your children. Don't come in twice looking for ice cream because you're not getting it.
Everybody was new. There was some of the older people that hadn't moved out, of course, because they were already in the red bricks and that wasn't part of the regeneration. So there were some people that had stayed in these. Was it the same? I would say no, because you were minus your family, you were minus your extended family. What there was a lot of poverty. There was still a lot of poor people. And poor people who don't have anything have no option but to make friends, find people that they feel are similar to them, that are not going to judge them. And that's what people did. They forged new friendships. And in that as well, I would say, developed new unbiological extended families.
Nobody was any different than anybody. So my mum worked, so the Frances at the end helped picking me up from school and they'd look after me while mum was working, then she'd come and collect me. And if you had needed some food, because people struggled, didn't have much in the 70s, you could knock on the door, you did ask for a bowl of sugar, you did ask for some milk, and they'd just look out for each other. There was nobody getting robbed, there was things like that, you were just there for each other.
The original purpose of Aquarius was a place for people to meet, and it became a place for children to play, because by that time, although we'd had green fields when we first moved to Hulme, they started building on them. They extended the brewery and they built Princess Parkway right through the heart of it, which cut the Aquarius estate off from the rest of Hulme. And so it became a youth club for young people to meet in the evenings. And for older people also, we had an over 50s group. In 1980, Manchester City Council recognised it and started giving some funding for the activities and pay for workers to work there, and that's when I got the job there.
The Crescent's the semicircle bits of concrete, and there was 4 of them. You had William Kent, you had Charles Barry, Robert Adam and John Nash. We lived in William Kent, but I would have loved to have lived probably in John Nash, only because the kids were much harder.
In Robert Adam, you had the actual bull ring, you had the Eagle pub, and in the early days, that actually had a fence around it. And I remember my mum made a lace, it was out of a lace curtain. She made a net that stretched across, and so you'd play tennis and things like that over that. Also, in that space, you'd play football, you'd play rounders, you'd chalk up on the wall cricket stumps, you'd play cricket. That's where we had the bonfires. You used to ride around that path as well. I've got scars on both knees, having been knocked over a couple of times.
You saw a clip of this Race 2000, so Tony made up this game where he got all the people on bikes, right, in the bull ring. And you get the idea of the game was you had to try and run across without getting run down by someone on a bike. Only Tony could come up with some stupidness like that. I just thought.
School holidays, the evenings were just great. We were all out in the big Otterburn Close playing football, playing kit can. And everyone knew everyone's mum and dad and stuff, so, the doors were left open, you could walk in and things like that, we're not a care in the world without fear of getting broken into. And if my mum never had a key or she wasn't in, I was able to stick my hand through the letterbox and then just up there, and it was just a latch, and it was just we used to have the big Hulme Carnival, which was another brilliant thing as well, So yeah, on the football fields for St Wilfrid's, we had the Donkey Derby and all different other things. There were stalls and tombolas and things like that.
I love steel pans, and I know we'd be in Charles Barry Crescent outside the White Horse nearly all night, listening to the steel band. But it was fantastic. The atmosphere was brilliant. But we used to wait for that coming every year.
I left St Margaret's School and moved to Royce, right? I just took a liking to this girl, yeah, and she says, "Oh, we're going swimming tomorrow. Can you swim?" So I said, "Oh yeah, of course I can swim." Oh yeah, anything to impress the girl at such a young age. Anyway, the next day, walking to the swimming baths in Hulme, the teacher says, "Oh, we've got a new pupil in our class, Clive is called, and he can swim apparently, from what I've heard." And I thought, oh my God, news travels quick. So anyway, the trainer says, right, young man, just jump in the shallow end. And you know what? That was the first time I'd seen a swimming pool.
I think play areas was a big issue. It was probably the beginnings of the adventure playground movement, and certainly, where do kids play became an issue in Hulme.
The adventure playground was built by the workers on there. They used to get old telegraph poles, old planks, and we'd help to build it. We'd be doing a bit of hammering and digging as well. But there was always a fire on the adventure playground, and usually with the fire there was a pot of food. So it was a pan of maybe stew. But to beef that up, they'd throw in a cup of rice or a cup of something that would stodge it up. So we'd all get fed, basically.
Oh, we played street games, but most of all we played on the adventure playground. That was my life from 3 years of age. So we played on wooden structures built by the community. So we call them swings, decks and dangles. You build your own bogey carts, and we had lots of subways, so you go down those. We'd do knock-a-door run, because you could run from every landing all over. That was brilliant. Roller skating on these dilapidated, adjustable metal things that ended up being thrown at people that everybody fell in. I don't know what shoes they were made for, but I spent nearly all my life on the adventure playgrounds.
Proctus, I remember we went on a youth exchange, me and Paul Alcott, to Amsterdam with them one year, and it was really bizarre because we actually were the only 2 white kids that went with them. To me and Paul and to the rest of the guys there and the staff, wasn't a problem. We got to Amsterdam, we did this radio interview, and it was all, they were firing questions to me and Paul, how do you feel being the only white kids there? What's different? How's the culture different? And we're just like, they're just our friends, they're just our big family, we all go to school together, we all play football together, we all do this. No, it was no different, but it seemed a bit alien to them that we were just the only 2 white kids on a mainly black youth exchange.
People used to get on, it was very diverse even back then, even though, you still had your problems, because like in the 70s, you know, with the racial stuff. But Hulme, it was almost like it was in a bubble, so we didn't really see any of that. Once you stepped out of that, then you thought, okay, yeah, it's time to come back into the bubbles, you know what I mean? So it was kind of safe.
So they originally were going to be gas-powered, as far as I know, gas fuel and gas heating. And then Ronan Point happened, an explosion in a tower block in London. I think that was about 1968, 69. After which, no gas in any high-rise or medium-rise building. So they scrapped the gas. And in 1973, there was an international fuel crisis based on oil, but it affected electricity and made the heating basically unaffordable for anyone who wasn't a millionaire or the royal family.
The heating was absolutely rubbish. It was warm air blow heating. So you'd put that on and after about 30 minutes or so, it would just be blowing cold air. So as a result of that, my parents had to buy paraffin heaters. Some people bought electric ones, but back then they bought paraffin heaters and they used to light those upstairs, you know, pretty dangerous when you think about it. Have those lit upstairs in the rooms to warm the rooms up. And the windows were aluminium framed windows, and because of that they were constantly cold and no proper heating. And of course we've introduced this paraffin heating. The condensation was absolutely terrible in the properties.
People were actually becoming poorer, living in these brand new homes than what they had been in these old houses they'd lived in. Many persons around me were experiencing dreadful problems of mould growing up their walls and not being able to keep their clothing in wardrobes.
Other problems was cockroaches, mice, rats, ants. Yeah. Do you know, when you were living in that, it didn't seem to bother you, but when you think about it with hindsight, you're like, wow, you actually lived in some horrendous conditions. I remember the council would bring us these little cockroach houses to put them down. There was a little patch of whatever it was, cockroach food in the middle of it, and the rest was all this sticky plastic thing around it. And then you get up in the morning and you'd lift up and there they all are, and you're like, right, okay, and then I actually just used to stand on the thing and kill them, and then you'd get another one. There was a big asbestos problem which nobody seemed to know about until you finally get told, and then next thing, your house looks like a scene out of E.T. Every single flat in the whole of Otterburn, Scarf Walk, Settle Walk, Hodder Square, all these lot got them done. So these big plastic sheets were there, guys in the white suits, you know, like coming from the nuclear bomb testing thing. And there was just a real small passageway for your door that was all taped up.
There was lumps of concrete dropping off the stairs and you'd have to walk over holes in the stairs. It was hard to imagine what people were going through, because everybody'd come in there being very positive and feeling happy that they'd got beautiful new homes with modern conveniences, as we thought them then, that they hadn't had before. But then for it all to collapse, and it did collapse around them, it was horrendous.
There was always a problem with so many people living off the ground in decks. And there was a big resistance to that, and that obviously found its feet after the terrible tragedy on the Crescents when a child died. And there was a lot of, you know, demands to be relocated. We don't want these streets in the sky. And the council actually, because it was back in Alan Roberts' day when Alan Roberts was chair, was very enlightened. Said, yeah, we made a mistake. We're going to move the families off.
Do you think Hulme should ever have been built?
No. No, of course it shouldn't. It's an absolute disaster. It's a mistake, and it shouldn't have been planned, and it shouldn't have been built.
Do you think Hulme should be demolished?
No. I think there's something we can do with it now we've got it.
Once more, I ask myself, what am I rooting for? A place I found myself in times before. You tell yourself that you deserve enough, but not too much till it gets too tough. You refuse to sweat the love when it's all out. How dare you seek change? I'm still trying to hold my best. Am I still trying out? It is what I make of it. It's not what your heart can.
suppose as groups became more focused on the housing issues, then the Community Arts Project followed that lead and became a good resource for people doing campaigning. So we had the Hulme-wide cockroach campaign, you know, when people were fed up with infestation and really wanted to make a big noise about this. And the Asbestos Campaign also was a big successful campaign. You know, once tenants knew that a lot of the housing was completely riddled with it, which was, you know, horrifying news on top of everything else. You know, I remember, you know, big public meetings, particularly over in Hulme 3 in Aquarius, big public meetings where people were just outraged that you know, such a major health hazard was in their midst. And I would here like to mention John Shires, if I can, who was one of the very active tenants at that time, who subsequently died of an asbestos-related illness.
I was at a Labour Party meeting, City Party meeting, which is when all members from across the city meet on a monthly basis. And Maureen Mumsami knew I was going to the meeting, and I was a delegate to City Party, she wasn't. And her and Maureen Mann wanted to come in, and they had 2 sacks of things with them. And they came into the Labour group, and up on our Lord Mayor's dais, and you know, they sat right up there, and they opened these sacks, and one sack was a sack of cockroaches, still alive, half of them, and the other sack was 5 dead rats that they'd brought in from the Crescents.
Okay, you've got your sort of, what's that big word, ratification from this conference, right? Is that right, Sheila, ratification? Right? But I know myself, that unless the likes of Maggie Thatcher and Gow and all the rest of them, unless they really do see us, you know, maybe 6 months from now, maybe 12 months from now, and we've all got a lot of hard work to do, and we need some resources off you, and we need you down in the area a lot more.
You know, she could make fantastic speeches, you know, just like off the top of her head, just like really good. Same for Maureen Mann, really. Maureen was a similar character in that she was able to just speak from the heart, and you would be in tears listening to them, you know, listening to them talk about their lives or what it was like living here, or just that their passion they had about something being different. And they were all really committed to making things different. And not just, I mean, they gave so much time and so much energy. I don't know how their families put up with them, really.
My mum was Maureen Mann, and she was just like, she was a very special person. No airs, no graces. She had respect for people, and to her, it didn't matter whether it was in a local community, whether it was local families that didn't have anything to eat, who didn't have stuff at Christmas, who didn't have a decent house, who didn't have no gas, electric, or they had a kid that was in prison. She was there to help with any of those issues.
Sally Casey on Aquarius, who, you know, was quieter in her leadership, shall I say, but also a very strong woman, and you didn't want to cross Sally either, because, you know, if she didn't agree with you, she'd tell you and you'd know about it.
The council never had any time for tenants or residents. You took what they gave you, you paid your rent, and that was it. If you had a repair, you reported it, and you waited for somebody to do something about it. But you didn't have a voice, and that's what was wrong. None of us had a voice. And we formed the Tenants and Residents Association. And at our first official meeting, we had 109 residents turned up to take on the council. And they had never seen anything like it in their lives.
Sally reminds me a bit of Caslock, who was a friend of mine. And Sally was the matriarch of the community for the generation that her children grew up in. You know, I see Sally as one of our great unsung heroines.
And Jenny was involved in the tenants associations, but really her passion was about the social side. So she helped us get the zone in the first place as a community resource centre. She could also be very angry and could kind of shout a lot. But I think just describing them as angry women doesn't really give them the credence that they had, because they were committed and passionate and knowledgeable and decent.
So there was my Auntie Mary, who wasn't my auntie, but a family that used to look after me when my mum worked. And she's probably where I am today was because of all the fight she did. She'd help everybody. She'd be any injustice be going around to housing offices and pull people up and be constantly having a go.
Mary France just had this really twinkly little. She was quite a sparrow of a woman, with this really twinkly little smile, and so she was great in meetings because Mary would turn up and she'd just smile at everybody and it would lighten it up. Whereas Mo Marn, whilst I have a long-standing and permanent respect for her, but she would silence the meeting just by sheer intimidation, because you didn't argue with Mo.
Today, I'd suggest that all representatives from tenants groups who are here today actually try in the near future to discuss both the declaration and what they think about a deck access campaign.
So my involvement in community life and community work in Hulme started off, I was living in the Crescents, so I got involved for something to do. I think I went to a carnival meeting and I suppose got hooked really. I went to my first meeting and that became another meeting, and then that might have been, do you want to help on the play scheme? And then a job came up with the Hulme Community Arts Project. I suppose that was the beginning really, or perhaps I'd already started my education, my proper political education of living somewhere that was very, very different to where I'd grown up and living amongst, amazing, amazing people. Sorry. And just starting to learn about life really. So being 19, 20, starting to learn about life.
She doesn't look for accolade, Bridget, but Bridget was like the diligent activist who covered all the ACEs, filled in application forms for people. Bridget was a draftee of the Hulme Action Plan. We did the Hulme Action Plan, but Bridget was the brains behind it. And it was her that drafted it, not the council. And we weren't willing for them to make any amendments to it. That was big stuff back then. Nobody was doing that.
The key people who were instrumental were people like Faye Selvin, were people like Peter Marcus, Charlie Baker, Maureen Mann, Maureen Moonsamy. They were all instrumental. You couldn't just pick out one because because they were strong people. They had a vision, and together they were an amazing cocktail.
I joined Humanby, or the Red Bricks Tenants Association, and got involved that way. And then after a bit, the council advertised for a consultation worker. And so I applied and got the job, which was fantastic. And my main job was support the tenants associations, who were great, and we had, I think, probably about 6 or 7 across Hulme in all the different areas with very active people. But they all had their own characters, and it really reflected the people who led them. So, of course, in Gretney Walk, Harry Sherwood, and then Peter Marcus was probably the younger end, more vocal, more campaigning, as in academic type campaigning, more political with a capital P, I would say.
I'm going to stay on council housing. And as council housing, they have to statutorily be maintained as decent places for people to live.
I came to Hulme as a student, university student, in about 1986. In exactly 1986, in fact. I was given the keys to 3 flats on Gretney Walk, which was the block of flats near the brewery, and asked to pick the one I liked and bring the other 2 keys back to the housing office, the Moss Side housing office, home of drugs, betting shops, and keys to flats. I was at university studying anthropology, and no offence to anthropologists, but it's a waste of time. And I had anthropology going on at university and housing and poverty going on in Hulme, and I was very quickly seduced to a bit of life I'd never seen before. I'd never experienced it. My parents were born in poverty in the East End of London, but that was a long time ago, and they got out of it. They'd aspired to become middle class, and they were lucky enough to have achieved it. And I'd inherited that luck. But in Manchester, I was seeing people who weren't so lucky. They were no less passionate, but they just weren't as lucky.
There was those that did have a vision, who came here as students, who went on to become workers, who stuck with the local community, and the local community stuck with them.
People like myself, Maureen Moon-Sammy, Maureen Mann, if there was a meeting going on in Hulme, we would refuse to allow anyone to suggest that we couldn't go. And so we accessed everything that was going on. We wanted to know what was happening, really, with the other side, because the meetings were mainly ex-grads who'd settled in Hulme after coming here as students, people like Charlie Baker. Charlie was a real leader in some of the work that went on.
That you put us somewhere where we feel comfortable and we can stay put until those issues have been resolved, rather than trying to move us out before we know where we're going to end up living.
And so I finally got myself a flat January 1985, and the only place they'd offer me one for me and a mate, because she wanted to move out of her place as well, was in Charlesbury Crescent. So obviously my view of the community in the 80s will elicit some ire from other people's view of the community in the 80s, because they're different. It's not one, there's not one single cohesive lump of people. It's lots of overlapping bunches of people. I can't think of anywhere else where you can encounter a Dalek on one deck of the flats, just motoring around because these two guys have decided they're going to make Daleks just for a laugh. And then you've then got a Viscount living upstairs. You've got two flatfuls of Chinese students around the corner because that was the only place they could find to live. You've got people that have been released out of detox or Prestwich needing somewhere to live, and this being the only place they could find them, and often dropped in with very little support. So the only support they had was their neighbours and who was going to knock on or keep an eye on them. And so you had, and then there was this other extreme that is the one that is much cited of the students as one, again, apparently cohesive bunch, and the people that were born here. I'd never encountered a community in that sense of the word, and I've said it a lot of times since. I think the problem we have in this country is too many people that make decisions about communities have no idea what one is.
I think by the mid-late 80s, the place had really changed. The family environment had moved much more towards singles and students. The drug culture had changed. It became a more aggressive and violent place. And the quality of the management and the maintenance had really gone down the tubes. So, you felt that this was a place in some sort of crisis and needed some change.
Manchester did not have any idea. Between about 84 and 89, they had no idea how to solve Hulme. It wasn't being managed anymore. And I think finally, in about 1990, Dave Luntz announced that Hulme was not manageable. A very brave statement politically, but it had been true for years, if not decades.
It was obviously a big debate that raged in the early 90s before the whole City Challenge thing came along about whether the approach that needed to be taken around the deck access housing in Hulme was comprehensive demolition and start again, not with all the stock but the deck access stock, or whether some of it should be saved and refurbished. And my view was that you had to get rid of the lot.
Well, having asked the government for 6 years for money for Hulme, the real story of the breakthrough is a bit odd. When Margaret Thatcher was deposed by Michael Heseltine, he didn't become leader of the Conservative Party, but he became Secretary of State of the Environment, and he'd got an appointment in Leeds, and he wanted to fill the rest of that space. And it happened that his private secretary was a close friend of mine from university. I'd been his best man. So he said, why don't you go and see Graham Stringer in Manchester? And we sat and talked for about 3 hours, and the two things that came out of that, both of which fundamentally changed Manchester. One was his support for the Olympic bit, and secondly, he told us about City Challenge, and we told him what we wanted to do with Hulme.
What we decided to do was to invite the 30, I think it was, local authorities who had very serious examples of social deprivation, communities with very real difficulties and needs, to become involved in a competition to win a packet of £35 million. That was £7 million over 5 years. And there were 10 packets. Well, you will immediately realise that if you invite 30 people to become involved, 30 local authorities, and you only have 10 packets, they're going to be losers. So this was hugely controversial.
Lord Heseltine played, but Michael, as we knew him, played an enormous role in the history of Hulme. He kept coming in. We could not keep the man away. He was here more often than the Direct Works Department. You know, he was really fond of Hulme because it was a brilliant press opportunity. The government wanted to say, towards the end of the 80s, early 90s, we want to make horrible council housing better. And what better place to say that than Hulme? He had to get a flight from London, get a taxi to Hulme, which only takes about 10 minutes from the airport if there's no traffic, and bingo, he's in some horrible council housing.
I mean, I remember the deck access, rat-infested slum. There's no other way to describe it. One of the worst housing conditions in Europe. People described it at that time. My scheme, City Challenge, was dealing with deprived communities. And not only did, therefore, in putting their bids together, the local authorities have to bring people together, but they then had to go and talk to the tenants themselves and say, look, these are our ideas, what do you think? So there were partnerships were created at the local level, bringing in the private sector, adding money, and then the tenants themselves were asked what they thought. And my ministerial team judged the 30 bids. We chose 10.
The City Council submitted a bid for a scheme which the government are running at the moment called City Challenge. And along with 10 other local authorities, we were told that we were winners of that particular scheme.
Well, it meant that there were now real changes coming. There were real choices that had to be made. And we were kind of over the sort of talking about things and the arguing about things. We actually had to make decisions, you know, which blocks are going to come down, how are we going to phase the redevelopment, what happens to, you know, different bits of the estate.
As you will have seen, properties in Hulme 2 on the St Wilfrid estate have already been demolished in the last couple of weeks, and the same is due to happen very shortly in Year 3 at the bottom end of Epping Walk on the west side of the estate. That replacement of very poor quality, very difficult to manage deck access housing by new build housing, which housing associations will provide.
So we said, well, let's go and talk to some housing associations. And tenants did that, not the council, tenants. Went to talk to Guinness and North British and Moscare and Arawak, and some of them said, why don't we start our own housing association? And they did, people first. And some of them said, well, we're a co-op, we've tried to build elsewhere in Manchester and that didn't work out, why don't we build in Hulme? And they did, Homes for Change. And we had these people who were craving the chance to build new property in Hulme, designed by people who lived there, who wanted to live there in the future, who had a stake in the area, and it wouldn't be the bloody council anymore. And you know what? That was the start of the housing policy that happened. And the council did go along with it eventually, and they did agree to start this joint company called Hulme Community Homes.
So there was quite a sort of complicated array of tenants and community organisations that had been in place in many cases for many years. And then there was a kind of apparatus put across that by, you know, the council and the community to try and put some sort of structure into it. And Hulme Community Homes was a big part of that apparatus. I think it broadly worked okay, but it was always slightly... there was always a lot of controversy and argument and debate.
So like St George's, Aquarius, the Forgotten Corner, the Bull Rings did see themselves as quite separate, but it was those women, those community activists that actually bridged those gaps and brought them together. And they had to be really strong to do that, because people, you know, I'm sure they had peers in those small communities that say, well, what are you doing that for? Well, I don't like that one and I don't like this one. But those women saw the bigger picture and saw that you had to overcome that, because you can be successful working together. But if you're divided, you can't. And as I said, they had a vision, they had a passion, and they had love. They had love for their community. Then they had, despite some of the absolutely outrageous arguments and debates, let's call them debates, that they had at some of the meetings, they had a real respect for each other and a love for each other and what they all wanted to accomplish.
Hulme's different from anywhere else because, you know, it sounds a bit corny, but it's true. It's all about the people that are there, and not just the people that are there today, but the people that have been there over many, many years, stretching way back, which always gave the place a fantastic kind of energy and a sense really that it wasn't going to be pushed around too much. You know, people want to kick back, people have got views, people are not just going to get walked over. And I always thought it was kind of in some ways the best of Manchester. You know, it was right cheek by jowl with the city centre. It was a really rich community drawn from different community, different ethnic groups in Manchester, different bits of Manchester's history. It's a place that, you know, it's got an absolutely extraordinary kind of history going way back. You know, this is where Mr. Rolls met Mr. Royce. This is a place where just over the road atomic science was invented. This is a place where massive Irish community lived. It's always had that kind of animation about it, and that, for me, that's what made it special. And one of the reasons why it would actually have been a tragedy to have left Hulme in that state that the planners and the engineers did to it in the 60s and 70s. It deserved a new lease of life and a new opportunity to breathe something into the place that would at least borrow something from that fantastic history it had.
If you look back on history, I don't think we'll find another place that's been totally demolished and rebuilt twice in my lifetime. I've seen 3 different Hulmes. I feel like I'm going to live forever, so I'll probably see a 4th one.
I am the most blessed, fortunate woman that I know, because this is my spiritual home. I don't need to go anywhere. I'm not afraid to go somewhere else. I'm not afraid of possibilities and opportunities to go outside, but there's still so much needs to be done here, and this is my spiritual home, and this is where I intend to stay. I don't make no apologies for it, but aren't I lucky?
So I often look back and look at old photographs, and it just gives me a warm feeling inside, and I'm missing the place as well, but just happiness, and just I would live that all over again in the blink of an eye. I wouldn't change a single thing.
When I did go back that time and I saw it all demolished when I got off that bus, I did still feel the energy. It was like it was coming up from the ground. I was breathing it in the air. The energy and the soul of Hulme was still there, even though the properties had gone and the people had gone.
And once more I ask myself, what am I rooting for? A place I found myself in times before. You tell yourself that you deserve enough, but not too much till it gets too tough. You refuse to sweat the love when it's all out. How dare you seek change? I'm still trying to hold my best. Am I still trying out? Is what I make of it. It's not what your heart can give until it's all out. Take it on, try to steady